Hey guys, welcome back to the Atlas Archives Deep Dive series, where tonight we're venturing into West Africa's most deliciously complex nation, Côte d'Ivoire. Now, before you worry about pronunciation, the locals simply call it the land where chocolate is born, which is both more romantic and significantly easier on the tongue. Picture a country that produces nearly half the world's cocoa, yet somehow manages to be one of Africa's best-kept secrets. From the lagoon-laced coastlines where Abidjan pulses with French colonial elegance, to the misty rainforests hiding some of humanity's closest relatives, the tool-using chimpanzees of IA. This is a nation that defies every assumption you might have about West Africa. Tonight, we're diving deep into the story of 60 ethnic groups who somehow learned to share one remarkable homeland, creating a cultural symphony that would make the United Nations weep with envy. We'll explore how ancient elephant paths became trade routes, how a legendary queen's sacrifice founded a kingdom, and why this small corner of Africa became the economic heartbeat of an entire region. Drop a comment letting us know what you're sipping while listening, coffee or hot chocolate, and we'll tell you which Ivorian plantation probably helped make it possible. And if you're ready for more African deep dives, that subscribe button is your best friend. So grab something warm, find your most comfortable position, and let's uncover the remarkable story of Côte d'Ivoire, where every cocoa bean has a 1,000-year history. Chapter 1. Welcome to the land of elephants. Picture, if you will, a country roughly the size of New Mexico, nestled along the Atlantic Ocean's Gulf of Guinea, like a comfortable armchair facing the sea. Côte d'Ivoire sits there quite contentedly between Ghana to the east and Liberia to the west, with Guinea and Mali keeping it company up north, and Burkina Faso playing the role of that neighbour who's always borrowing sugar. The country stretches about 322 miles from east to west, and about 400 miles from the northern borders down to the southern coastline, making it roughly the perfect size for an elephant to take a leisurely stroll across, which is rather fitting given the country's historical connection to these magnificent creatures. Speaking of elephants, you might wonder why this land became known for ivory in the first place. Well, imagine if you will, the coastal forests of Côte d'Ivoire in centuries past, when massive herds of elephants wandered through the dense tropical forests like living, breathing monuments to nature's grandeur. These weren't your average garden variety elephants, mind you, but the African forest elephant, smaller than their savanna cousins but with straighter, harder tusks that made particularly fine ivory. The irony, of course, is that today you'd have better luck spotting a unicorn than finding wild elephants roaming freely in most of Côte d'Ivoire, though conservation efforts are working to change that rather depressing state of affairs. Now, let's talk about the people who call this place home. With a population of approximately 28 million souls, Côte d'Ivoire is like that friend who somehow manages to fit everyone at their dinner party, even when they said they were only inviting a few people. The country hosts over 60 different ethnic groups, each with their own languages, traditions, and presumably their own opinions about the proper way to prepare cassava. The largest groups include the Akan in the south and east, the Voltaic or Gur in the north, the northern Mande in the northwest, and the southern Mande in the west. It's like a beautifully complex family reunion that's been going on for centuries, complete with all the linguistic diversity you'd expect from such an arrangement. French serves as the official language, a leftover from the colonial period that stuck around like that houseguest who came for the weekend and never quite left. However, most Ivorians are multilingual, speaking their ethnic language at home, French at work or school, and often a local trade language called Dioula for good measure. It's rather like having multiple outfits for different occasions, except instead of clothes, it's entire ways of communicating with the world. The capital city situation in Côte d'Ivoire is delightfully complicated in a way that would make political scientists rub their hands together with glee. Officially, the capital is Yamoussoukro, a planned city in the centre of the country that was the birthplace of Félix Houphouët-Boigny, the country's first president. However, Abidjan, the former capital and largest city, still serves as the economic capital and is where most government institutions actually operate. It's rather like announcing that your bedroom is now the family headquarters, while everyone continues to gather in the kitchen anyway. Yamoussoukro, with a population of around 300,000, is famous for having one of the largest churches in the world, the Basilica of Our Lady of Peace, which can seat 18,000 people. This magnificent structure was built in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and its dome is slightly larger than that of St. Peter's Basilica in Vatican City. Imagine the conversation at the Vatican when they discovered they'd been architecturally one-upped by a city most people couldn't find on a map without a magnifying glass and considerable patience. Abidjan, meanwhile, is home to over 4 million people and serves as the beating heart of Ivorian commerce and culture, built around a lagoon system. It's often called the Manhattan of Africa due to its impressive skyline, though presumably with fewer yellow taxis and considerably more tropical humidity. The city is divided into several communes, each with its own personality. From the upscale Cocody district where diplomats and business executives reside to the bustling markets of Tryckville where you can buy everything from traditional textiles to spare motorcycle parts. The country's economy has historically been built on agriculture, and Côte d'Ivoire currently produces about 40% of the world's cocoa beans. That's right, there's a decent chance that the chocolate you enjoyed last week began its journey in an Ivorian cocoa pod. The country is also a major producer of coffee, though not quite at the scale of their cocoa dominance. It's rather appropriate that a country whose name comes from elephant tusks now deals primarily in the raw materials for humanity's other great addiction besides ivory, chocolate. The climate in Côte d'Ivoire is what meteorologists politely call tropical, which is a scientific way of saying it's hot and humid enough to make your glasses fog up just thinking about it. The country experiences two main seasons, a wet season from May to October, when the Atlantic Ocean generously dumps enormous quantities of water on the land, and a dry season from November to April, when the harmattan winds blow down from the Sahara Desert like nature's own hairdryer. During the wet season, some areas can receive over 80 inches of rainfall, which is enough water to make even the most dedicated rain enthusiast consider taking up desert hiking as a hobby. Geographically, Côte d'Ivoire can be divided into 4 main zones, each with its own personality and preferred type of vegetation. The coastal region features lagoons, beaches, and dense forests that look like something out of a nature documentary. The forest zone in the central south is where most of the country's cocoa grows, in plantations that stretch as far as the eye can see under a canopy of trees. The savanna region in the centre and north features grasslands dotted with trees, perfect for cattle grazing and giving visitors that authentic Lion King feeling. Finally, there's the Sudanese savanna in the far north, which is drier and more sparse, as befitting an area that's essentially saying hello to the Sahara Desert. The country's highest point is Mount Nimba, which reaches about 5,700 feet above sea level and sits right on the border with Guinea and Liberia. It's part of the Nimba Range and is notable for being a UNESCO World Heritage Site due to its unique ecosystem and the fact that it's home to several species found nowhere else on Earth. Mount Nimba is like that exclusive club that's so selective, even the animals have to be special to get in. Rivers play a crucial role in Ivorian geography, with 4 main river systems draining the country. The Sassandra River flows southward to the Atlantic. The Bandama River cuts through the centre of the country like a liquid highway. The Como River drains the eastern regions, and the Kavli River forms part of the border with Liberia. These rivers have served as transportation routes, sources of fish, and presumably the inspiration for countless philosophical conversations about the nature of flowing water and the passage of time. The Atlantic coastline stretches for about 300 miles and features a mix of sandy beaches, rocky outcrops, and lagoons that would make any travel brochure photographer weep with joy. However, the coast is also known for its powerful surf and strong currents, which means that while the beaches are beautiful, they're more of the admire from a respectful distance variety rather than the casual weekend swimming type. Côte d'Ivoire's location in West Africa has made it a crossroads of cultures, trade routes, and historical influences for centuries. The country sits at the intersection of ancient trade networks that connected the Sahara with the Atlantic coast, making it a place where gold, salt, and ideas moved back and forth like passengers on the world's oldest subway system. This geographical position has shaped not only the country's history but also its remarkably diverse cultural landscape. Today, Côte d'Ivoire stands as one of West Africa's largest economies and most influential nations, though like many countries in the region, it has faced its share of challenges including political instability, economic fluctuations, and the ongoing effects of climate change. The country gained independence from France in 1960, making it a relatively young nation by historical standards, though the land itself has been home to human civilizations for thousands of years. As we settle in for our journey through Ivorian history and geography, it's worth noting that this is a country of remarkable contrasts. It's a place where ancient traditions coexist with modern technology, where French colonial architecture stands alongside traditional African buildings, and where the sounds of multiple languages create a daily symphony of human communication. It's a country that has experienced both tremendous prosperity and significant hardship, often within the same generation. The story of Côte d'Ivoire is ultimately a story about adaptation, resilience, and the enduring human capacity to build communities in the face of changing circumstances. From the ancient kingdoms that once flourished in this region to the modern nation navigating 21st century challenges, it's a tale that encompasses themes as universal as they are specifically African. The natural beauty of Côte d'Ivoire extends beyond its geographical features to encompass an extraordinary biodiversity that would make any nature enthusiast's heart skip a beat. The country's forests are home to over 4,000 plant species, including valuable hardwood trees like mahogany and iroko that have been prized for centuries. The Thai National Park, one of the last remnants of the Upper Guinea rainforest, harbours endangered species like the West African chimpanzee, the pygmy hippopotamus, and over 200 bird species that create a daily chorus rivaling any symphony orchestra. In terms of mineral resources, Côte d'Ivoire is blessed with more than just agricultural wealth. The country has significant deposits of gold, diamonds, iron ore, bauxite, copper, and nickel, though these resources have been both a blessing and a source of conflict throughout the nation's history. It's rather like inheriting a treasure chest that everyone else also wants to open, leading to complications that no amount of wishful thinking can resolve. The educational system in Côte d'Ivoire reflects the country's multilingual nature, with primary education conducted in French, but many children growing up speaking their ethnic language at home. The University of Cocody in Abidjan serves as the premier higher education institution, though accessing quality education remains a challenge in rural areas where schools might be as rare as air conditioning in the Sahara Desert. Religion in Côte d'Ivoire is as diverse as everything else about the country, with Islam dominant in the north, Christianity prevalent in the south, and traditional African religions maintaining their influence throughout the country. Many Ivorians practice a blend of faiths that would make theologians scratch their heads in fascination, creating a spiritual landscape that's both complex and remarkably tolerant. The country's transportation infrastructure tells its own story of development and challenge. The port of Abidjan serves as one of West Africa's major shipping hubs, handling cargo not just for Côte d'Ivoire but for landlocked neighbours like Mali and Burkina Faso. Meanwhile, the road network varies dramatically from modern highways connecting major cities to dirt paths that become temporary rivers during the rainy season. As we conclude this introduction to Côte d'Ivoire, it's worth reflecting on the fact that this is a country that defies simple categorization. It's simultaneously one of Africa's most urbanized nations and deeply connected to rural traditions. It's economically successful, yet faces persistent poverty. It's politically stable now, but has experienced significant turmoil in recent decades. These contradictions aren't problems to be solved, but rather the natural complexity of a nation that encompasses multiple worlds within its borders. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, let your mind wander to this corner of West Africa, where the Atlantic Ocean meets ancient forests, where 60-plus ethnic groups have found ways to share the same national space, and where the legacy of elephants lives on in both memory and aspiration. In the next chapter, we'll delve deeper into the pre-colonial history of this fascinating land. But for now, simply rest in the knowledge that you've begun to glimpse a country whose story is as rich and complex as the chocolate that grows in its fertile soil. Chapter 2: Before the Europeans Arrived. The story of pre-colonial Côte d'Ivoire reads like a complex family saga, where cousins keep moving house, kingdoms rise and fall with the regularity of soap opera plot twists, and trade routes crisscross the landscape like ancient highways built by merchants with excellent GPS systems. For thousands of years before any European set foot on West African shores, this region was home to sophisticated societies, powerful kingdoms, and migration patterns that would make modern travel bloggers jealous of their frequent flyer miles. Archaeological evidence suggests that humans have been calling this corner of West Africa home for millennia, though the humid tropical climate has not been particularly kind to preserving ancient artifacts. It's rather like trying to maintain a library in a steam room, which explains why much of what we know about early Ivorian history comes from oral traditions, the living memory banks of West African societies that have preserved stories with remarkable accuracy across generations. The early inhabitants of what would become Côte d'Ivoire lived in scattered communities throughout the forest and savanna regions, practicing agriculture and developing sophisticated systems of trade that would make modern economists weep with admiration. These were not isolated villages struggling to survive, but interconnected societies that understood the value of networking long before social media made it fashionable. They cultivated yams, raised livestock, and developed metalworking techniques that produced tools and weapons of impressive quality. By the 11th century, northern Côte d'Ivoire had become drawn into the vast trans-Saharan trade networks that connected sub-Saharan Africa with North Africa and the Mediterranean world. The Ghana Empire, despite its name having nothing whatsoever to do with modern Ghana, extended its influence into the northern savanna regions of present-day Côte d'Ivoire. This empire was followed by the even more impressive Mali Empire, which at its peak controlled trade routes stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the bend of the Niger River. The collapse of the Mali Empire in the 16th century set off a chain reaction of migrations that would reshape the demographic map of Côte d'Ivoire like a massive game of musical chairs played across centuries. When the music stopped, new kingdoms had emerged, populations had relocated, and the stage was set for some of the most fascinating political developments in pre-colonial West African history. It was during this period of upheaval that many of the ethnic groups we associate with modern Côte d'Ivoire found their way to their present locations. The Dioula people, whose name literally means trader in the Mande language, became the master merchants of the region following the Mali Empire's decline. These commercial innovators established trading posts throughout the savanna regions, creating networks that moved everything from gold and salt to kola nuts and ivory across vast distances. The Dula didn't just trade goods, they traded ideas, technologies, and religious beliefs, serving as the internet of their era but with considerably more walking involved. In the early 18th century, the Dula established what would become one of the most significant pre-colonial states in the region, the Qing Empire. This wasn't just a trading post that got too big for its britches, but a sophisticated Islamic state centered around the city of Qing in what is now northern Côte d'Ivoire. Under the leadership of Sékou Ouattara and his descendants, Qing became both a major commercial center and a renowned seat of Islamic learning, attracting scholars and students from across West Africa like a medieval university with considerably better weather. The Qing Empire represented something of a golden age for Islamic civilization in the region. The city featured impressive mosques, madrasas where students studied Arabic and Islamic law, and libraries that preserved manuscripts covering everything from theology to astronomy. It was the kind of place where you could get an excellent education and engage in profitable trade, assuming you could survive the occasional wars with neighbouring kingdoms who were less enthusiastic about Qing's expansion plans. Meanwhile, in the southeastern regions of what would become Côte d'Ivoire, another series of kingdoms was taking shape, though these had their origins in dramatic events occurring in what is now Ghana. The rise of the powerful Asante Empire in the late 17th and early 18th centuries triggered a series of migrations westward into Ivorian territory that would fundamentally alter the region's ethnic and political landscape. The most significant of these migrations involved the Ebron people, who established the Kingdom of Giaman sometime in the 17th century. Founded by Tandate and his followers, Giaman became a powerful state that controlled important trade routes and gold mining regions. However, like many smaller kingdoms in the shadow of larger empires, Giaman found itself caught in the expanding sphere of Asante influence and was eventually conquered by its more powerful neighbour in the 1730s. The Anyi people established two kingdoms that would prove remarkably resilient, Indenie and Sanwi. These states, founded by Akan migrants fleeing the consolidation of Asante power, developed their own unique political systems while maintaining cultural connections to their Ghanaian origins. Both kingdoms demonstrated a remarkable ability to maintain their identity and autonomy even under pressure from larger neighbours, a skill that would serve them well during the colonial period and beyond. But perhaps the most famous migration story in Ivorian history involves Queen Abla Pokou and the founding of the Bole Kingdom around 1750. This tale combines historical fact with mythic elements in a way that would make Hollywood screenwriters frantically scribble notes. According to both oral tradition and historical records, Pokou was a member of the Asante royal family who found herself on the wrong side of a succession dispute following the death of Asantehene Opoku Ware in 1750. When the succession struggle in the Asante capital of Kumasi turned violent and her brother Dakon was killed, Queen Pokou faced a choice between submission to the new ruler or exile. Being the sort of person who preferred to write her own destiny rather than let others hold the pen, she chose exile, leading a substantial group of followers westward into what is now central Côte d'Ivoire. The legend of Queen Pokou's crossing of the Komoy River has become one of the most powerful origin stories in West African oral tradition. According to the tale, when Pokou and her followers reached the flooding river with Asante warriors in pursuit, the queen consulted with her spiritual advisors about how to ensure safe passage. The river spirits, it was determined, demanded the ultimate sacrifice, the life of what was most precious to the queen. In a moment that demonstrates both the power of leadership and the terrible costs of statecraft, Queen Pokou allegedly threw her infant son into the raging waters. The sacrifice was accepted, the waters calmed, and magical creatures, some versions speak of hippos, others of a mystical bridge, allowed the refugees to cross safely. Upon reaching the other side, the grief-stricken queen reportedly cried, "Bawuli," meaning the child is dead, which became the origin of the name Baole. Whether one interprets this story as literal historical fact or powerful metaphor, it speaks to themes that resonate across cultures: the sacrifices required for leadership, the costs of founding new societies, and the way communities create meaning from traumatic experiences. The Baole kingdom that emerged from this dramatic beginning would become one of the most influential states in pre-colonial Côte d'Ivoire, developing a sophisticated political system that blended Akan traditions with local customs. The Baole political structure centered around a queenship that rotated among different royal clans, a system that ensured no single lineage could dominate while maintaining legitimate royal authority. This wasn't just a feel-good democratic experiment, but a practical solution to the challenges of governing a diverse population in a resource-rich territory where competing claims to power could quickly turn violent. In the northern savannah regions, another formidable kingdom emerged in the late 17th century, when Baunkani migrants from the Gold Coast region established the Buna Kingdom. This state developed into an important Islamic center and educational hub, with Buna City becoming known for its scholars and its role as a staging ground for pilgrims heading to Mecca. The kingdom's political structure reflected the hierarchical nature of many West African Muslim states, with an aristocratic class involved in slave trading and taxation, ruling over peasant farmers and Dula merchants. The late 19th century brought a figure to northern Côte d'Ivoire who had become one of the most significant military leaders in West African history. Samori Touré. Born around 1830 in what is now Guinea, Samori built an empire that at its peak stretched from Sierra Leone to Burkina Faso, including much of what is now northern Côte d'Ivoire. This wasn't your typical medieval warlord riding around on horseback demanding tribute, but a sophisticated military strategist who understood that survival in the age of increasing European encroachment required adaptation and innovation. Samori's Wassoulou Empire represented something entirely new in West African political organization, a militarized state specifically designed to resist European colonial expansion. Unlike traditional kingdoms that were primarily organized around trade, agriculture, or religious authority, the Wassoulou Empire was essentially a military machine that could manufacture its own weapons, maintain professional armies, and execute complex strategic retreats across thousands of miles of territory. The empire's military innovations were remarkable for their time and place. Samori established weapon workshops that could repair and even manufacture firearms, creating a degree of military-industrial capacity that most African states lacked. His armies were organized along modern lines with standardized training, uniforms, and command structures that would have impressed European military observers had they not been busy trying to defeat these forces. Samori's approach to empire building was pragmatically inclusive in ways that would make modern diversity consultants proud. While he was a devout Muslim who promoted Islamic law and education, he allowed traditional religious practices to continue in many areas and recruited followers from diverse ethnic backgrounds. His empire was held together not by shared ethnicity or ancient tribal loyalties, but by a combination of military prowess, economic opportunity, and the shared goal of resisting European colonization. The Wassoulou Empire's expansion brought Samori into direct conflict with the Kong Empire when he conquered and destroyed the city of Kong in 1897. This wasn't just a military victory, but the end of an era, as Kong had represented the culmination of centuries of Islamic civilization in the region. The destruction of Kong symbolized the transition from the age of classical West African kingdoms to the age of resistance movements, specifically organized to confront European imperialism. What made Samori's empire particularly formidable was its mobility. Unlike traditional African kingdoms that were tied to specific territories and agricultural bases, The Wasulu Empire could literally pick up and move when circumstances required it. This mobile approach to statecraft allowed Samri to fight a running campaign against French colonial forces for nearly 2 decades, repeatedly establishing new capitals and administrative centres as strategic conditions changed. The economic foundation of these societies rested on agriculture, trade, and specialised crafts that created considerable wealth. Gold mining in regions like Bonduku provided precious metals for international trade. The kola nut trade connected forest regions with savanna and beyond, as these caffeine-containing nuts were highly prized in Muslim societies where alcohol was prohibited. This created trade networks stretching from Ivorian forests to North African markets, essentially serving as the coffee industry of its era. Religious diversity characterized these societies, with traditional African religions coexisting alongside Islam, which had been introduced through trade networks. This religious pluralism required sophisticated systems of accommodation that kept societies functioning despite fundamental differences in worldview. Many rulers found Islam attractive not just spiritually but for practical benefits in trade relationships and diplomatic recognition. As we reach the end of our exploration of pre-colonial Côte d'Ivoire, it's worth reflecting on the complexity and sophistication of the societies that flourished in this region long before European colonialism arrived. These were not simple tribal societies waiting for civilization to arrive from outside, but dynamic political entities that created art, architecture, literature, and systems of government that addressed the challenges of their time and place with considerable creativity and success. The legacy of these pre-colonial kingdoms and empires would profoundly shape the colonial experience, and continues to influence modern Côte d'Ivoire in ways both obvious and subtle. The ethnic diversity created by centuries of migration, the commercial networks established by doular traders, the political traditions developed by various kingdoms, and the resistance strategies pioneered by leaders like Samori Touré all became part of the foundation upon which the modern nation would eventually be built. Chapter 3. The Colonial Chapter. The transformation of Côte d'Ivoire from a patchwork of independent kingdoms into a French colony is a story that combines European imperial ambition, African resistance, administrative incompetence, and the kind of cultural misunderstandings that would make anthropologists weep into their field notes. It's a tale that begins with handshake agreements on beaches and ends with a new nation emerging from the wreckage of 2 world wars and the collapse of colonial certainties. The initial French involvement with the Ivorian coast began not with grand imperial designs, but with the sort of pragmatic opportunism that characterized much of early European colonial activity in West Africa. In 1843 and 1844, French Admiral Louis-Édouard Bouët-Wellomez signed treaties with the kings of Grand Bassam and Assini, establishing these coastal regions as French protectorates. These weren't conquest documents, but rather agreements between supposedly equal partners, though the fine print would later prove rather more binding for one side than the other. The early French presence was precarious in the way that all overseas ventures tend to be when they depend on the cooperation of people who have every reason to reconsider their agreements. French traders and officials operated from a handful of coastal trading posts, engaging in the time-honoured colonial tradition of buying low and hoping to sell high, while gradually extending their influence inland through a combination of diplomacy, commerce, and the occasional show of force. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871 temporarily derailed French colonial ambitions, forcing France to withdraw forces from West Africa and focus on more pressing matters closer to home. It's remarkable how European conflicts thousands of miles away could determine whether African kings had to deal with French administrators or were free to run their own affairs, illustrating the increasingly interconnected nature of the 19th century world. When France returned to active colonial expansion in 1886, it did so with considerably more determination and organizational capacity. Lieutenant Louis-Gustave Binger and merchant Marcel Triclaplaine embarked on expeditions into the interior that would fundamentally reshape the political map of West Africa. Between 1887 and 1889, these men negotiated a series of treaties that extended French influence from the coastal lagoons to the headwaters of the Niger River basin. The process of treaty-making in 19th century Africa was often an exercise in mutual misunderstanding, with both sides believing they had negotiated agreements that served their interests, while fundamentally misinterpreting what the other party thought they were agreeing to. African rulers often viewed these treaties as trade agreements or military alliances, while French officials considered them legal documents transferring sovereignty. It was rather like two people signing what each believes is a completely different contract. On March 10th, 1893, the colony of Côte d'Ivoire was officially established with Captain Louis-Gustave Binger as its first governor and Grand Bassam as its capital. This administrative act transformed what had been a collection of protectorates and trading relationships into a formal colonial territory subject to French law, French administration, and French economic priorities. The irony, of course, was that declaring something a colony and actually controlling it turned out to be two entirely different enterprises. The early years of French colonial rule were marked by the sort of resistance that should have surprised no one but somehow always did. Samori Touré's Wassoulou Empire, which we encountered in our previous discussion, represented the most formidable challenge to French expansion. His forces combined traditional African military organization with modern weapons and tactics, creating an adversary that France could defeat only through sustained military campaigns and considerable expenditure of resources. The capture of Samori in September 1898 marked the end of large-scale military resistance to French rule, but it hardly meant the end of opposition to colonial authority. The imposition of a head tax in 1900 sparked revolts across the territory, as many Ivorians interpreted this levy as a violation of the protectorate agreements they thought they had signed. The tax was seen not just as an economic burden, but as a humiliating symbol of submission that transformed traditional relationships of reciprocity into one-way extraction. Colonial economic policy in Côte d'Ivoire followed the standard European playbook of turning colonies into suppliers of raw materials and markets for manufactured goods. Coffee, cocoa, and palm oil plantations were established along the coast, often using forced labour systems that bore an uncomfortable resemblance to slavery despite France's official abolition of the institution in 1905. It was rather like declaring that theft was illegal while simultaneously requiring people to hand over their possessions. From 1904 to 1958, Côte d'Ivoire existed as part of French West Africa, a federation that encompassed 8 territories governed from Dakar. This arrangement meant that Ivorian affairs were decided not just in Paris but also in Senegal, adding another layer of bureaucracy to the already complex business of governing people who had never asked to be governed in the first place. Administrative decisions often reflected the priorities of the federation rather than local conditions, creating the kind of policy mismatches that made colonial government a masterclass in unintended consequences. The forced labour system, known as corvée, required adult males to work a fixed number of days annually on public works projects without compensation. This wasn't just an economic arrangement, but a fundamental reorganization of African societies around European priorities. Traditional agricultural cycles, kinship obligations, and community responsibilities were subordinated to the labour demands of road construction, railway building, and plantation agriculture. World War I brought new demands for both men and materials from the colonies. Thousands of Ivorians were conscripted to serve in French forces, often fighting in European trenches far from home in a war that had nothing to do with African interests. The colonial administration also intensified resource extraction to support the war effort, further straining already stretched communities and creating resentments that would simmer for decades. The interwar period saw efforts at economic development that primarily benefited European settlers and French commercial interests. The railway was extended to facilitate the movement of goods from the interior to coastal ports. Coffee and cocoa production expanded, and Western-style schools and hospitals were introduced. However, these improvements came with strings attached, as they were designed to integrate African societies more thoroughly into the colonial economic system rather than to promote genuine development. World War II fundamentally altered the relationship between France and its colonies, though not initially in ways that suggested greater freedom for Africans. Following France's defeat in 1940, Côte d'Ivoire found itself under the authority of the Vichy government, which espoused Nazi racial theories and implemented even more exploitative policies than the previous colonial administration. The irony of African colonies being governed by a regime allied with Nazi Germany, while African soldiers fought against fascism in other theatres, was not lost on educated Africans. The Vichy period intensified economic exploitation and introduced overt racial discrimination that had previously been disguised behind paternalistic rhetoric about civilizing missions. French planters increased their labour recruitment demands, military conscription expanded, and production quotas were imposed to supply armed forces at the expense of local food security. Britain's naval blockade created shortages that fell most heavily on African populations, while colonial administrators prioritised European needs. Between 1940 and 1942, French West Africa remained loyal to the Vichy regime, though this loyalty was more administrative than popular. Ivorians generally favoured the Free French under Charles de Gaulle, understanding that the defeat of Nazi Germany offered better prospects for African liberation than collaboration with fascist regimes. The eventual shift to Free French authority in 1942 was welcomed by most of the population, though it did not immediately translate into significant improvements in colonial policy. The post-war period brought the emergence of organised African political movements that would ultimately challenge the foundations of colonial rule. In 1944, Félix Houphouët-Boigny, a Baoulé doctor and prosperous planter, founded the African Agricultural Union, known by its French acronym SAA. This organisation united African farmers who were dissatisfied with colonial labour policies and discriminatory practices that favoured European planters. Houphouët-Boigny's background gave him unique credibility in challenging colonial policies. As a successful cocoa farmer, he understood the economic realities facing African producers. As a medical professional, he had witnessed the health impacts of forced labour and poor working conditions. As a member of a chiefly family, he possessed traditional authority that colonial officials found difficult to dismiss. His combination of Western education and African roots made him an ideal leader for the emerging independence movement. The SAA quickly gained support from nearly 20,000 plantation workers and became a powerful voice for African interests. The organisation was explicitly anti-colonialist and anti-racist, demanding better working conditions, higher wages, and the abolition of forced labour. Its success irritated European colonists to the extent that they took legal action against Houphouët-Boigny, inadvertently increasing his popularity as the voice of African resistance to colonial exploitation. In 1945, Houphouët-Boigny was elected to the French Constituent Assembly, providing him with a platform in the heart of the French political system from which to advocate for colonial reform. His election represented a significant milestone in the evolution of African political consciousness, as it demonstrated that Africans could master the European political process and use it to advance their own interests. Houphouët-Boigny's most significant legislative achievement was the law abolishing forced labour throughout the French Empire, which the Assembly adopted in 1947 This legislation eliminated what had been perhaps the most hated aspect of colonial rule, though its implementation required constant vigilance to prevent administrators from finding creative ways to continue exploiting African labour under different names. In 1946, Houphouët-Boigny helped establish the African Democratic Rally, a pan-West African political organisation that sought equality for Africans within the French system. The Ivorian branch was called the Democratic Party of Côte d'Ivoire and became the dominant political force in the territory. This party structure provided the organisational foundation for the eventual independence movement, while initially working within the colonial framework. The 1950s witnessed a complex dance between French officials trying to maintain control through gradual reform and African politicians pushing for meaningful autonomy. The Loy-Cadre reforms of 1956 introduced universal suffrage and elected territorial assemblies, expanding African political participation while preserving ultimate French authority. Houphouët-Boigny's political strategy was notably pragmatic, focusing on gradual advancement rather than immediate independence. Unlike other African leaders who demanded immediate liberation, he believed political independence without economic independence would be meaningless. This reflected his understanding that Côte d'Ivoire's prosperity depended on maintaining connections to France and international markets. The 1958 referendum on the French Constitution presented African territories with a choice between joining the French community with limited autonomy or immediate independence, with loss of French support. Unlike Guinea, which voted for immediate independence, Côte d'Ivoire chose the French community, reflecting Houphouët-Boigny's belief in gradual transition. However, the dynamics of decolonization across Africa made this arrangement unsustainable. As other territories achieved independence, Côte d'Ivoire found itself increasingly isolated. Houphouët-Boigny recognized the choice was becoming independence or irrelevance, and he began maneuvering towards sovereignty while maintaining beneficial relationships with France. The path to independence involved delicate negotiations with French authorities and neighbouring territories. Houphouët-Boigny opposed the Mali Federation, which would have linked Senegal and French Sudan, because he believed such arrangements would dilute Ivorian sovereignty. His efforts to prevent this federation's expansion demonstrated his diplomatic skill and commitment to Ivorian autonomy. On August 7, 1960, Côte d'Ivoire achieved independence with Félix Houphouët-Boigny as its first president. This transition was remarkably peaceful compared to the violent decolonization experiences of some other African countries, reflecting both the effectiveness of Houphouët-Boigny's gradual approach and France's recognition that maintaining influence through cooperation was preferable to attempting control through force. The independence constitution established a presidential system with strong executive powers, drawing inspiration from both American and French models. Houphouët-Boigny designed this system to provide the decisive leadership he believed necessary for economic development, though critics argued it concentrated too much power in a single individual and limited democratic participation. The colonial legacy left Côte d'Ivoire with both assets and liabilities as it embarked on independence. The transportation infrastructure, educational systems, and cash crop economy provided a foundation for development, though they also created dependencies on international markets and foreign expertise. The political institutions reflected French rather than African traditions, creating ongoing tensions between modern governance and traditional authority. As we conclude this exploration of Côte d'Ivoire's colonial experience, it's worth reflecting on the complex legacy of this period. The transformation from independent kingdoms to French colony to sovereign nation involved the disruption of traditional societies, the creation of new forms of political and economic organization, and the emergence of a modern state that combined African and European elements in unique ways. Understanding this colonial experience is essential for comprehending the challenges and opportunities that would face independent Côte d'Ivoire in the decades that followed. Chapter 4: Modern Côte d'Ivoire. The story of independent Côte d'Ivoire reads like a political drama, where the same three actors have dominated centre stage for over 30 years, taking turns in the spotlight, while the country experienced both spectacular success and devastating conflict. It's a tale of economic miracles and civil wars, of prosperity and poverty, of unity and division, all playing out in a nation that somehow managed to survive political earthquakes that would have shattered less resilient societies. When Félix Houphouët-Boigny assumed the presidency in 1960, he inherited a country with enormous potential but also significant challenges. The new nation had inherited colonial infrastructure and administrative systems, but it also faced the task of building a unified national identity from 60-plus ethnic groups, managing an economy dependent on agricultural exports, and navigating the complex currents of Cold War politics, while maintaining beneficial relationships with France. Houphouët-Boigny's approach to these challenges was pragmatically conservative in a way that distinguished him from many other African leaders of his generation. While other newly independent nations pursued radical ideologies, nationalized foreign enterprises, or attempted rapid industrialization, Houphouët-Boigny chose a path of liberal capitalism, close cooperation with France, and agricultural development that would become known as the Ivorian model. The economic strategy focused on expanding cash crop production, particularly cocoa and coffee, through smallholder farming rather than state-controlled plantations. This approach built on colonial foundations but scaled up production through government support for peasant farmers, including access to fertile southern lands, extension services, and improved seedlings. The policy attracted migrant workers from neighbouring Burkina Faso, Mali, and other Sahelian countries, who provided the labour force for agricultural expansion. Between 1960 and 1980, this strategy produced remarkable results that earned the nickname Ivorian Miracle. Cocoa production tripled to over 300,000 tonnes, making Côte d'Ivoire the world's largest producer. Coffee production increased by nearly 50%. The economy doubled in size during this 20-year period, while per capita income rose to become the second highest in sub-Saharan Africa among countries without petroleum exports. The success attracted international attention and investment, as well as continued migration from neighbouring countries. By 1980, foreign workers, mostly from Burkina Faso, represented over a quarter of the Ivorian population. This demographic shift would later create tensions, but during the boom years, it was seen as evidence of Côte d'Ivoire's prosperity and opportunity. Both Ivorians and foreigners began referring to Houphouët-Boigny as the Sage of Africa for engineering this economic transformation. Politically, Houphouët-Boigny maintained a one-party system under the Democratic Party of Côte d'Ivoire, but his rule was notably less repressive than many other African single-party states. He preferred co-optation to coercion, bringing potential opponents into the ruling party rather than imprisoning or eliminating them. Political prisoners were almost non-existent, and the regime maintained legitimacy through economic performance and skillful management of ethnic and regional tensions. The key to this political stability was Houphouët-Boigny's careful balancing of regional and ethnic interests within the ruling party and government institutions. Cabinet positions, government contracts, and development projects were distributed in ways that ensured no single group felt completely excluded from the benefits of independence. It was rather like managing a very large family, where everyone needed to feel they were getting their fair share of dinner. Houphouët-Boigny's foreign policy maintained exceptionally close ties with France through a relationship he termed France-Afrique. French advisors held key positions in the Ivorian government. French companies dominated many sectors of the economy, and French cultural influence remained strong. This arrangement provided Côte d'Ivoire with technical assistance, investment, and political support, while giving France a reliable ally and profitable economic relationships in West Africa. However, by the 1980s, cracks were beginning to appear in the Ivorian miracle. Declining world prices for cocoa and coffee, rising debt service costs, and increased competition from other producers created economic pressures that strained the system. The population living below the poverty threshold increased from 11% in 1985 to 31% by 1993. Unemployment rose, particularly among educated youth who had expected prosperity to continue indefinitely. These economic problems coincided with growing political tensions as Houphouët-Boigny aged, and questions arose about succession. The president had never publicly designated an heir, and various factions within the ruling party began maneuvering for position. The economic downturn made it more difficult to maintain the patron-client networks that had sustained political stability, while educated Ivorians increasingly demanded political liberalization and democratic reforms. Houphouët-Boigny's death on December 7, 1993, marked the end of an era and the beginning of a succession crisis that would reshape Ivorian politics. According to the constitution, National Assembly President Henri Konan Bédié automatically became president, but he faced an immediate challenge from Prime Minister Alassane Ouattara, who had been effectively running the government during Houphouët-Boigny's final illness. The power struggle between Bédié and Ouattara was resolved in favour of Bédié, but it established a pattern of rivalry that would dominate Ivorian politics for the next 3 decades. More significantly, it introduced ethnic and regional dimensions to political competition that had been largely managed under Houphouët-Boigny's leadership. Bédié represented the Akan peoples of the south and east, while Ouattara was identified with the northern regions and Muslim populations. To consolidate his power and eliminate Ouattara as a political rival, Bédié introduced the concept of Ivoirité, or Ivorianness, which redefined Ivorian identity in exclusive terms that marginalized northerners and immigrants. This nationalist ideology claimed that only authentic Ivorians should hold political power or own land, and it questioned the citizenship of anyone with foreign ancestry or connections to neighboring countries. The introduction of Ivoirité marked a fundamental departure from Houphouët-Boigny's inclusive approach to national unity. Where the founding president had celebrated Côte d'Ivoire's diversity and welcomed immigrants as contributors to national prosperity, Bédié's ideology portrayed foreigners and northerners as threats to Ivorian identity and economic security. It was rather like a family deciding that distant cousins were no longer welcome at holiday gatherings. Ouattara became the primary target of Ivoirité politics, as his opponents claimed he was not truly Ivorian due to his birth in northern Côte d'Ivoire, his education in Burkina Faso, and his international career. Constitutional changes required presidential candidates to be born of 2 Ivorian parents and to have resided continuously in the country for 5 years prior to elections, provisions clearly designed to exclude Ouattara from political competition. The 1995 presidential election, which Bédié won with 96% of the vote after opposition parties boycotted the contest, demonstrated the divisive effects of Ivoirité. Rather than promoting national unity, the ideology created deep ethnic and regional cleavages that would prove increasingly difficult to manage. Economic problems continued to worsen, while political tensions escalated in ways that undermined the stability Houphouët-Boigny had carefully constructed. On December 24, 1999, a military coup led by General Robert Gué overthrew Bédié's government, citing corruption, economic mismanagement, and the divisive effects of Ivoirité politics. The coup was initially welcomed by many Ivorians who hoped military intervention would restore stability and national unity. However, Gué's transitional government soon proved to be as divisive and exclusionary as its predecessor. The 2000 presidential election became a travesty of democratic competition when Gué's Supreme Court disqualified 14 of 19 candidates, including both Bédié and Ouattara. This left only Laurent Gbagbo of the Ivorian Popular Front as a significant challenger to Gué himself. When vote counting showed Gbagbo winning, Gué attempted to declare himself the victor, triggering popular protests that forced him to flee the capital and allowed Gbagbo to claim the presidency. Gbagbo's assumption of power marked the arrival of the third major figure in post-Houphouët-Boigny Ivorian politics, a historian and longtime opposition leader who had been imprisoned and exiled under the one-party system. Gbagbo represented the Bété people of southwestern Côte d'Ivoire and brought a different regional and ethnic base to the presidency. However, his government continued to exclude Ouattara and his supporters, perpetuating the divisions that Ivoirité had created. The exclusion of northern populations and Ouattara supporters from political participation created grievances that eventually erupted into armed rebellion. On September 19, 2002, a mutiny by northern soldiers evolved into a full-scale insurgency led by the new forces, which quickly gained control of the northern half of the country. This marked the beginning of Côte d'Ivoire's first civil war. The rebellion reflected the failure of post-Houphouët-Boigny governments to maintain the inclusive political arrangements that had sustained stability for 3 decades. The new forces claimed to represent northerners, Muslims, and immigrants who had been marginalized by Ivoirité politics and excluded from meaningful political participation. Their control of the north created a divided country with competing governments and military forces. French military intervention prevented the rebels from capturing Abidjan and overthrowing Gbagbo's government, but it could not resolve the underlying political crisis. A series of peace agreements, including accords signed in Marcoussis, France, and later in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso, established power-sharing arrangements and timelines for elections, but implementation proved difficult due to continued mistrust between the parties. The First Civil War officially ended in 2007, but the country remained divided and tensions persisted. Presidential elections, originally scheduled for 2005, were repeatedly postponed due to disagreements over voter registration, citizenship verification, and the disarmament of militias. The delays reflected the difficulty of organizing democratic competition in a country where the fundamental question of who qualified as a citizen remained contested. When elections were finally held in 2010, they produced a crisis that was in many ways worse than the original civil war. The first round of voting in October saw Gbagbo win 38% of the vote, followed by Ouattara with 32% and Bédié with 25%. The runoff between Gbagbo and Ouattara was held on November 28th, with international observers deeming it largely free and fair despite some irregularities. The Independent Electoral Commission declared Ouattara the winner with 54% of the vote, but Gbagbo's Constitutional Council rejected results from northern regions and declared Gbagbo the victor. Both candidates took the presidential oath of office, creating a constitutional crisis with 2 competing presidents, 2 governments, and 2 sets of military forces. It was rather like a chess game, where both players declared checkmate simultaneously. The international community, including the United Nations, African Union, European Union, and former colonial power France, recognized Ouattara as the legitimate winner and called for Gbagbo to step down. However, Gbagbo refused to accept defeat, claiming that widespread fraud in northern areas had invalidated Ouattara's victory. This position received little support outside Côte d'Ivoire, but was backed by Gbagbo's security forces and allied militias. What followed was 6 months of post-election violence that devastated the country and claimed approximately 3,000 lives. Gbagbo's forces targeted Ouattara supporters with systematic violence, including mass killings, sexual violence, and forced displacement. Pro-Ouattara forces, initially organized as the New Forces and later renamed Republican Forces, responded with their own offensive that gradually gained control of most of the country. The violence reached its climax in the Battle for Abidjan in March and April 2011, as Ouattara's forces, supported by United Nations and French military intervention, surrounded Gbagbo's strongholds in the economic capital. Despite attempts at negotiation, Gbagbo continued to resist until his capture on April 11, 2011, effectively ending the Second Civil War and confirming Ouattara's presidency. Ouattara's presidency, beginning in May 2011, faced enormous challenges rebuilding a country devastated by political crisis and civil wars. Infrastructure had been destroyed, institutions collapsed, and social trust severely damaged. The new government pursued national reconciliation while seeking accountability for war crimes through truth commissions and courts. Economically, the government focused on restoring growth through public investment and foreign direct investment. Political stability, high cocoa prices, and infrastructure development produced impressive growth rates, averaging over 7% annually during the 2010s. However, ethnic polarization continued to shape politics, as demonstrated when Ouattara's controversial third term in 2020 triggered opposition protests and violence. The remarkable recent development has been reconciliation between the three main political leaders. Following Gbagbo's return in 2021, historic meetings between Ouattara, Gbagbo, and Bédié represented efforts to move beyond personal rivalries and ethnic divisions. Bédié's death in August 2023 marked another generational transition in Ivorian leadership. Looking back over 6 decades of independence, Côte d'Ivoire's journey reflects both achievements and limitations of post-colonial governance. The country demonstrated that inclusive leadership and economic growth could sustain stability, as shown during Houphouët-Boigny's era. However, it also illustrated how political exclusion and ethnic polarization could destabilize even successful societies. Chapter 5: Geography and Climate. If Côte d'Ivoire were a person, it would be someone with remarkably good posture who prefers comfortable temperatures and enjoys both mountain hiking and beach walks, sometimes on the same day. This West African nation presents a geographical personality that combines dramatic variety with surprising accessibility, offering everything from towering rainforest canopies to expansive grasslands, from mountain peaks that scrape the clouds to lagoons that mirror the sky. The country's basic layout is refreshingly straightforward for a place with such complex ecological diversity. Côte d'Ivoire occupies roughly 322,000 square kilometers, making it approximately the size of New Mexico or Poland, depending on your preferred geographical reference point. The nation sits comfortably between 8 degrees north latitude and 5 degrees west longitude, positioned like a geographic centerpiece between its neighbors Guinea and Liberia to the west, Mali and Burkina Faso to the north, Ghana to the east, and the Atlantic Ocean's Gulf of Guinea to the south. The overall terrain can be visualized as a massive, gently sloping plateau that rises gradually from sea level along the southern coast to approximately 500 meters in elevation at the northern borders. This isn't dramatic mountain building, but rather the kind of gradual elevation change that makes for pleasant drives and explains why rivers flow so reliably from north to south. It's rather like living on a very large, very gentle hillside that takes an entire country to climb. The southern coastline stretches for about 515 kilometres along the Gulf of Guinea, creating a maritime boundary that has shaped both the country's history and its contemporary economy. This coast is characterised by a fascinating system of interconnected lagoons that run parallel to the ocean for over 300 kilometres, separated from the open Atlantic by narrow sandbars and barrier islands. These lagoons create natural harbours and transportation networks that have been crucial to both traditional fishing communities and modern commercial ports. The lagoon system begins near the Ghana border and extends westward, creating what geographers call the lagoon region. The largest and most important of these water bodies is the Ebrier Lagoon, which houses the port city of Abidjan and serves as the economic heartland of modern Côte d'Ivoire. These lagoons are typically shallow and brackish, connecting to both the ocean and inland river systems in ways that create unique ecosystems, supporting everything from commercial fisheries to rare waterbird populations. Behind the coastal lagoons, the land rises into what was once an almost continuous belt of tropical rainforest, stretching from Ghana to Guinea. Today, this forest region represents both Côte d'Ivoire's greatest natural treasure and its most pressing conservation challenge. Much of the original forest has been cleared for agriculture, particularly cocoa and coffee plantations, but significant protected areas preserve examples of what was once one of West Africa's most magnificent ecosystems. The crown jewel of these forest reserves is Tai National Park, located in the southwestern part of the country near the border with Liberia, covering approximately 5,364 square kilometres. Tai protects the largest remaining primary rainforest in all of West Africa. This isn't just any forest, but a UNESCO World Heritage Site that harbours over 50 species found nowhere else on Earth. Walking into Tai is like stepping into a biological time machine that shows what much of coastal West Africa looked like before human intervention began reshaping the landscape. The park's rainforest is the stuff of nature, documentaries, and childhood dreams about jungle adventures. Massive trees soar to heights of 60 metres. Their enormous trunks supported by buttress roots that could hide entire families. The forest canopy is so dense that only about 2% of sunlight reaches the forest floor, creating a cathedral-like atmosphere where shafts of golden light occasionally pierce through to illuminate the green twilight below. It's the kind of place where you instinctively speak in whispers, not because anyone requires it, but because the forest itself seems to demand reverence. Tai is home to some of West Africa's most charismatic and endangered wildlife. Western chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, have developed sophisticated tool-using behaviours here that continue to astound primatologists. Forest elephants, smaller than their savanna cousins but no less magnificent, move through the trees like grey ghosts, maintaining ancient migration patterns. The park also protects pygmy hippos, which are exactly as adorable as they sound, and about as rare as you'd expect, something that's charming to be in the modern world. Moving inland from the forest belt, the landscape gradually transitions into the forest-savanna mosaic that characterises central Côte d'Ivoire. This ecological transition zone is neither fully forest nor completely grassland, but rather an intricate patchwork that interlaces woodland, savanna, and grassland habitats. The mosaic creates edge environments that support particularly high biodiversity, while providing the mixed landscapes that have been ideal for traditional African agricultural systems. The northern half of the country is dominated by savanna landscapes that form part of the West Sudanian savanna ecoregion. Here, the land opens into broad grasslands dotted with scattered trees that provide shade and serve as focal points for wildlife and human activity alike. During the rainy season, these savannas transform into vast green carpets that stretch to the horizon, while the dry season reveals the underlying red lateritic soils that give the landscape a distinctly African character. This northern savanna region is home to Como National Park, another UNESCO World Heritage Site that protects one of the largest intact savanna ecosystems in West Africa. Covering over 11,000 square kilometers, Comoé offers a completely different but equally spectacular natural experience from Tai. Where Tai overwhelms with its dense green intensity, Comoé impresses with its vast open spaces and the drama of wildlife adapted to seasonal extremes of abundance and scarcity. The Comoé River, which gives the park its name, creates a ribbon of gallery, forest and wetlands that winds through the savanna like a green highway for wildlife movement. During the dry season, these riparian zones become crucial refuges for animals ranging from hippopotamuses and crocodiles to countless species of birds. The river's presence also explains why plants typically found much farther south can survive in this more arid environment, creating biological islands of unexpected diversity. Côte d'Ivoire's river systems are among the most elegant examples of drainage patterns you'll find anywhere. 4 major rivers flow from north to south, creating parallel drainage basins that efficiently collect rainfall from across the country and deliver it to the Atlantic Ocean. The Cavally River drains the western regions, forming part of the border with Liberia. The Sassandra River handles the west-central areas, while the Bandama River, the country's longest at about 800 kilometers, drains the central regions and passes near the capital of Yamoussoukro. The easternmost major river is the Como, which originates in Burkina Faso and flows through the national park that bears its name, before emptying into the eastern end of the Ebrié Lagoon. These rivers have been crucial to human settlement patterns, agricultural development, and economic activity for centuries. They've also been modified by several major dam projects that have created significant lakes for hydroelectric power generation and water management. Lake Kossou, created by damming the Bandama River in the 1970s, is the largest of these artificial lakes and has become an important feature of the central landscape. The lake not only provides electricity and water resources, but has also created new ecosystems that support fishing industries and wetland bird populations. It's rather like giving the country a new major geographical feature through engineering. Though one that required relocating thousands of people and flooding ancient settlements. The only significant mountains in Côte d'Ivoire are found in the western regions near the borders with Guinea and Liberia. The Man Mountains, also known as the Dix-Huit Montagnes region, rise to elevations exceeding 1,400 meters and create a dramatically different landscape from the rest of the country. These peaks, including Mount Nimba at 1,752 meters, are remnants of ancient geological processes and support unique montane forest ecosystems. Mount Nimba, which Côte d'Ivoire shares with Guinea and Liberia, is particularly significant both geologically and biologically. The mountain is part of a UNESCO World Heritage Site that protects ecosystems found nowhere else on Earth. The summit environment supports specialized plants and animals adapted to the cooler temperatures and higher rainfall found at elevation, creating biological islands that harbor endemic species and serve as refuges during climate fluctuations. Climate in Côte d'Ivoire follows patterns that would make meteorologists happy with their predictability and farmers grateful for their general reliability. The country experiences a tropical climate that transitions from equatorial conditions in the south to more arid savanna conditions in the north. This climatic gradient corresponds closely with the vegetation patterns, creating a logical progression from rainforest through woodland to grassland as you travel northward. The southern regions, particularly around the coast and in the forest zone, experience what climatologists call an equatorial humid climate. This means warm temperatures year-round, with averages between 25 and 30 degrees Celsius, and abundant rainfall that can exceed 2,000 millimeters annually in some areas. The humidity is correspondingly high, creating the steamy greenhouse-like conditions that support rainforest vegetation and make visitors feel like they're breathing through a warm, wet towel. Southern Côte d'Ivoire experiences a complex seasonal pattern with 4 distinct periods that local residents navigate with the expertise of people who have learned to read the sky like a calendar. The main rainy season runs from May to July, bringing heavy, regular rainfall that can turn dirt roads into temporary rivers and makes the forest canopy so thick with moisture that it creates its own weather systems. This is followed by a brief dry period in August and September, then a shorter rainy season from October to November, and finally the main dry season from December to April. The northern regions experience a more straightforward 3-season pattern that reflects their position in the tropical savanna climate zone. The warm and dry season lasts from November to March, when temperatures are comfortable and rainfall minimal. This gives way to the hot and dry period from March to May, when temperatures can soar above 40 degrees Celsius and the landscape takes on a bleached, almost desert-like appearance. Finally, the hot and wet season from June to October brings relief in the form of rain but maintains high temperatures that create challenging conditions for both humans and wildlife. The transition between these climate zones isn't abrupt but rather gradual, creating microclimates and ecological niches that support the remarkable biodiversity for which Côte d'Ivoire is famous. Annual rainfall decreases from over 2,000 millimeters in the south to around 1,000 millimeters in the north, while temperature ranges become more extreme as you move away from the moderating influence of the Atlantic Ocean. One of the most distinctive features of the northern dry season is the arrival of the harmattan winds, which blow southward from the Sahara Desert beginning around November. These dry, dusty winds can dramatically reduce visibility and create hazy conditions that give the landscape an ethereal, almost otherworldly quality. The harmattan brings cooler temperatures but also increases fire risk and can stress vegetation adapted to higher humidity levels. Climate change is affecting these traditional patterns in ways that concern scientists and communities. Rainfall has become less predictable, with some regions experiencing more intense dry seasons, while others see shifts in rain timing that disrupt agricultural cycles. Forest loss has reduced local evapotranspiration, potentially contributing to decreased rainfall and altered regional weather patterns. The country's remarkable biodiversity reflects this geographic and climatic diversity. Over 1,300 plant species have been identified in Tai National Park alone, while the national flora includes over 4,000 species. The transition from forest to savanna creates edge effects and habitat diversity that support exceptional animal populations, including over 250 mammal species, more than 600 bird species, and countless insects, reptiles, and amphibians. This biodiversity represents both a tremendous natural asset and a significant conservation challenge. Côte d'Ivoire has lost approximately 90% of its original forest cover over the past 50 years, primarily due to agricultural expansion and logging. The remaining forest patches are increasingly isolated, creating problems for animal populations that require large territories or seasonal migration routes. As we consider Côte d'Ivoire's geography and climate, it becomes clear that this nation occupies one of Africa's most environmentally significant regions. The country serves as a bridge between the humid forests of the Guinea coast and the arid savannas of the Sahel, creating transition zones that harbour unique ecosystems and support remarkable biodiversity. Understanding these geographical foundations provides essential context for appreciating both the country's natural heritage and the environmental challenges it faces in an era of rapid global change. Chapter 6: Culture, Economy, and Daily Life. As our journey through Côte d'Ivoire draws to a close, we arrive at perhaps the most vibrant and complex chapter of all, the living, breathing reality of modern Ivorian life. This is where the threads we've woven through history, politics, and geography come together in the everyday experiences of 28 million people who wake up each morning in a country that perfectly embodies the beautiful complexity of contemporary Africa. Picture Côte d'Ivoire as a massive family reunion where 60 different ethnic groups have gathered under one roof, each bringing their own traditions, languages, and favourite dishes. Somehow, despite occasional disagreements over who gets to control the remote or where to hang the family portraits, they've managed to create something remarkably cohesive. The result is a cultural tapestry so rich and intricate that it makes medieval European courts look positively monotonous by comparison. The foundation of this cultural complexity rests on four major ethnic groupings that divide the country like quarters of a cultural compass. In the east, centre, and southeast, the Akan peoples dominate the landscape, descendants of 18th century migrants from the Asante kingdom who brought sophisticated systems of governance and artistry. The Baoulé, who make up the largest single ethnic group at 23% of the population, trace their origins to Queen Abla Pokou's legendary migration, while the Agni and other Akan subgroups maintain distinct identities within this broader family. The southwest belongs to the Kru peoples, probably the oldest residents of present-day Côte d'Ivoire, whose largest group is the Bete. These communities developed hunting and gathering societies that adapted brilliantly to forest environments, creating political structures that emphasized village-level democracy rather than centralized kingdoms. Their cultural contributions include some of West Africa's most distinctive artistic traditions and a fierce independence that has shaped political consciousness throughout the region. Northern Côte d'Ivoire is home to two distinct cultural families. The Voltaic peoples, including the Senufo and Lobi, created agricultural societies known for spectacular artistic achievements, particularly in mask making and sculpture. Meanwhile, the Mande groups, including the Malinké and Dioula, brought trading networks and Islamic influences that connected Côte d'Ivoire to the broader Sahelian world. The Dioula language serves as a lingua franca for trade throughout the region, making it almost as important as French for daily commerce. Language in Côte d'Ivoire reflects this cultural diversity in ways that would make linguists dizzy with excitement. While French serves as the official language and the medium of education and government business, over 60 indigenous languages thrive in daily conversation. A typical Ivorian might conduct business in French, chat with neighbours in Baoulé, bargain at the market in Dioula, and sing lullabies in their grandmother's village language. Its linguistic code switching raised to an art form that would impress the most sophisticated polyglots. Religious life adds another layer of complexity to this cultural foundation. According to recent census data, 43% of Ivorians practice Islam, 34% follow various Christian denominations, 4% maintain traditional African religions, and the remainder consider themselves freethinkers or combine multiple belief systems. What makes this particularly interesting is how fluidly many Ivorians move between religious practices, incorporating elements of traditional spirituality into Islamic or Christian worship in ways that create uniquely African expressions of faith. The most remarkable aspect of Ivorian religious life is not the diversity itself, but the general tolerance and peaceful coexistence between communities. While religious differences occasionally align with political tensions, particularly between the Muslim North and Christian South, the everyday reality for most Ivorians involves routine interaction across religious boundaries. Extended families often include members of different faiths, and business partnerships regularly cross religious lines without generating the conflicts that might be expected in other contexts. Art and cultural expression in Côte d'Ivoire represent one of Africa's richest creative traditions, with each ethnic group contributing distinctive styles and techniques that have influenced artistic development across West Africa. No country produces a wider variety of masks than Côte d'Ivoire, with carvers creating everything from the elegant human-like goli masks of the Baoulé to the dramatic animal-inspired creations of the Dan people in the Western Mountains. These masks aren't museum pieces, but living elements of cultural practice used in ceremonies that mark everything from harvest celebrations to coming-of-age rituals. The Fêtes des Masques, held each December in the city of Man, attracts visitors from across West Africa who come to witness competitions between villages and honour the forest spirits that these elaborate creations represent. It's rather like a combination of Halloween, the Olympics, and a religious ceremony, all rolled into one spectacular cultural event. Music permeates Ivorian life in ways that make it impossible to separate sound from society. The traditional approach emphasizes polyphonic compositions where multiple rhythms and melodies occur simultaneously, creating layered soundscapes that mirror the country's cultural complexity. Every ethnic group has developed distinct musical traditions, from the talking drums that once carried messages across vast distances to the balafon xylophones that accompany storytelling sessions in village squares. The role of griots' traditional storytellers, musicians, and keepers of oral history remains crucial in preserving and transmitting cultural knowledge. These master performers serve as living libraries, carrying genealogies, historical narratives, and moral teachings through generations of carefully practiced songs and stories. Modern Ivorian music blends these traditional foundations with contemporary influences, producing artists like Alpha Blondy, whose reggae music carries messages of social consciousness and African unity to audiences worldwide. Daily life in Côte d'Ivoire varies dramatically between urban and rural environments, creating a country that contains everything from gleaming high-rises to traditional mud-brick compounds. Abidjan, the economic capital, pulses with the energy of nearly 6 million people navigating a metropolis that combines French colonial architecture, modern office buildings, and sprawling neighbourhoods where traditional African community structures persist within urban settings. The contrast between Abidjan's sophisticated plateau district, with its banks and government buildings, and the bustling markets of Adjamé, where vendors speaking a dozen languages hawk everything from imported electronics to traditional medicines, captures the essential duality of modern Ivorian life. Urban dwellers navigate between world markets and village traditions, often maintaining strong connections to rural communities while pursuing careers in international business, technology, or the arts. Rural life centers around agricultural rhythms that have sustained communities for generations, though modern influences increasingly penetrate even the most remote villages. Most rural families live in compounds built around courtyards, with structures ranging from traditional mud and thatch constructions to concrete houses with corrugated metal roofs. The extended family remains the basic social unit, with decisions made collectively and resources shared according to traditional obligations and expectations. Food culture provides one of the most accessible windows into Ivorian society, with culinary traditions that reflect both the country's agricultural abundance and its cultural diversity. Rice serves as the foundation for most meals, often accompanied by sauces that vary dramatically between regions and ethnic groups. The national dish, atieke, consists of grated cassava that's fermented and steamed, usually served with grilled fish and spicy pepper sauce that can bring tears to uninitiated eyes. Aloko, fried plantains with onions and hot peppers, represents the kind of street food that fuels daily life across the country, while kedjanu, a slow-cooked chicken stew prepared in sealed clay pots, showcases the sophisticated cooking techniques that turn simple ingredients into memorable meals. Meals are typically eaten communally, with everyone gathering around shared dishes and using their right hands to form rice and sauce into bite-sized portions, a practice that reinforces social bonds and cultural values with every shared meal. The economic foundation of modern Côte d'Ivoire rests on agricultural production that has made the country a global powerhouse in several commodities. Cocoa production accounts for 45% of world supply, employing over 6 million people and generating 20% of national GDP. Most production comes from smallholder farmers working 2 to 3 hectare plots using traditional techniques, while seeing only a fraction of profits when their raw beans become expensive chocolate. Beyond cocoa, Côte d'Ivoire is the world's largest cashew producer, with coffee, rubber, palm oil, cotton, and bananas providing additional export earnings. 2/3 of the population remains directly dependent on farming, creating vulnerability to price fluctuations and weather patterns. The government seeks economic diversification through agricultural processing and manufacturing, recognizing that shipping raw materials while importing finished products represents economic weakness. Industrial development has accelerated significantly since the end of civil conflicts in 2011, with investments in food processing, textiles, construction materials, and assembly operations for vehicles and machinery. The port of Abidjan serves as a regional hub for West African trade, handling cargo for landlocked neighbours like Mali and Burkina Faso, while positioning Côte d'Ivoire as a gateway for international commerce. Energy production represents one of the brightest spots in the economic picture, with hydroelectric dams and natural gas discoveries providing both domestic electricity and export opportunities. Côte d'Ivoire maintains some of the highest electricity coverage rates in West Africa, with over 95% of urban areas and nearly 50% of rural communities having access to power. The country exports electricity to neighbouring nations, generating revenue while supporting regional development. However, the benefits of economic growth remain unevenly distributed. Nearly 40% of Ivorians live below the national poverty line, with rural communities and northern regions experiencing higher poverty rates than urban southern areas. While Abidjan's middle class enjoys modern amenities, millions lack access to clean water, adequate health care, and reliable education. Education represents both progress and challenges. Primary enrollment exceeds 95% following the abolition of school fees, but 30% of children fail to complete primary education due to poverty or inadequate facilities. Higher education has expanded, but job creation hasn't kept pace with educated graduates entering the workforce. Healthcare follows similar patterns, with quality urban facilities contrasting sharply with limited rural services. The government has initiated mandatory health insurance schemes, but implementation remains incomplete, particularly where formal employment is rare. Traditional healing practices continue playing important roles alongside modern medicine. Family structure remains remarkably resilient despite rapid social change, with extended families continuing to serve as primary support networks for everything from childcare and education to business financing and old age security. However, urbanization and economic pressures are gradually modifying traditional patterns, particularly around marriage, child rearing, and gender roles. Women's roles have evolved significantly, with constitutional guarantees of equal rights and legislation requiring 30% female representation in political positions. However, legal equality hasn't eliminated traditional practices like arranged marriages or female genital mutilation, particularly in rural areas where customary law often takes precedence over national legislation. Women increasingly participate in higher education and professional careers, but they also continue to bear primary responsibility for household management and childcare. The informal economy provides livelihood opportunities for millions of Ivorians who work as market vendors, artisans, transporters, and service providers without formal employment contracts or social protection. This parallel economy demonstrates remarkable creativity and resilience, but it also leaves workers vulnerable to economic shocks and lacking access to credit, training, or retirement security. Looking toward the future, Côte d'Ivoire faces the classic challenges of a developing country, translating resource wealth into broad-based prosperity while managing rapid demographic change. With over 40% of the population under 15, the country must create millions of jobs while improving education and healthcare systems that can support productive lives for young people who will shape the nation's future. Climate change adds urgency to these development challenges, with changing rainfall patterns affecting agricultural productivity and requiring adaptations in farming practices. The loss of forest cover has altered local weather patterns, and continued deforestation threatens both biodiversity and environmental sustainability. Despite these challenges, Côte d'Ivoire's cultural foundation provides remarkable resources for addressing complex problems. The tradition of palaver community discussion and consensus building offers models for democratic participation. The concept of Ubuntu emphasizes communal solidarity and mutual responsibility, providing social capital that helps communities weather difficulties. The hospitality that visitors consistently encounter reflects deeper cultural values about human dignity and community responsibility. The greeting Akwaba welcome represents more than politeness. It embodies a worldview that sees individual well-being as inseparable from community health and prosperity. Côte d'Ivoire's story reminds us that nations, like individuals, are works in progress, constantly evolving through the interaction of historical inheritance and contemporary choices. The elephant paths that once guided traders through ancient forests have become highways carrying modern commerce, but the essential human qualities of resilience, creativity, and community that sustained earlier generations continue to provide the foundation for whatever future this remarkable nation will create for itself and its people.